This is our 8th lesson in our series covering the evidence for the Bible. In our most recent lessons, we've been diving into the history of the church's recognition of the New Testament canon, and today we're addressing the question at the heart of it all: do we have the correct books? So, let's get to it. I will give you a heads up from the get-go that many of the things we talk about today are going to sound like things that we've already addressed in the past, and that's because they are. What we're going to be talking about today is us revisiting things we've addressed in the past, but we're going more in depth, and we're going to be looking at the earliest evidence that we have. And so, thing to remember, number one, just like with the Old Testament, we don't have a clear play-by-play outline of how or when the apostolic writings were recognized. Like I said, we've already addressed this point more thoroughly in the past, so I won't belabor it now, but my main point, and the main thing you need to remember, is that if you want a clear step-by-step process for how exactly the early church identified the New Testament canon, you will not find it. The process took time, which actually works in the favor of the authenticity of the canon itself, demonstrating that the list isn't attributed to a single powerful individual or group of individuals who were forcing an agenda. Instead, it was a gradual process of recognition that took place over time. We might wish we had finer details, but we don't, and so everything we're talking about over the course of this series is us having to piece things together based off the information we do have. Thing to remember number two, however, the evidence that we've examined gives us a rough idea as to how the early church identified the correct books. Again, we don't want to overstate our case and suggest that the early church had a four-factor identification process. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but the evidence we do have would suggest that the following guidelines were primary considerations when it came to evaluating whether or not a book belonged in the canon. The first criteria is apostolicity. As we've already seen, the church was built on a foundation of apostolic authority. It only follows that, in attempting to determine the New Testament canon, the most important question was, does this text go back to the people that Christ gave authority to carry the message? The book had to be written by an apostle, such as Paul, Peter, John, or Matthew, and if not by an apostle, then by someone in their immediate circle like Mark or Luke, a group of people which scholars call the apostolic community. If a text lacked apostolic origin or endorsement, it had no claim to scriptural authority. This is why the New Testament comes to a close with the works of the Apostle John, who traditionally is universally attested to as being the last living apostle. It is also why, as we will see, a few books were disputed. Churches exercised caution and didn't want to declare a book authoritative unless they could confirm that it was apostolic in origin, and that's stuff that we're going to talk about in today's video. The second criteria is orthodoxy. The word orthodoxy literally means right belief, and it refers to sound doctrine. The Torah, the foundational text of the Hebrew Scriptures, made it clear that prophets must be tested. Their words must bear evidence of being divine in origin, and their words can't contradict prior revelation because God doesn't lie. Even if a book proclaimed itself or declared that it was apostolic in origin, subsequent questions had to be asked. Does the text align with the Hebrew Scriptures? If not, then it isn't from God. Furthermore, does it align with the rest of Christian doctrine? Is it consistent with the verbal and confirmed teachings of the apostles? Is it consistent with the other apostolic writings that have already been confirmed? If not, then it isn't from God and cannot be canonical, and these were things that had to be considered when evaluating these different books. The third criteria is usage. Another question the early church had to wrestle through was, has this book been used for a long time? Even if a book claimed to be by an apostle, and even if it had orthodox teaching, if the book only popped up in the late 2nd century and there was no evidence of it being used prior to then, it's highly unlikely that it tied back to the actual apostles themselves. And if the book didn't trace back to the times of the apostles, then it couldn't be apostolic in origin. It might be a useful writing and even worthy to be studied, but it couldn't be an authoritative rule of faith. This then leads us to the fourth criteria, which is Catholicity. When we hear the word Catholic, we often think of the Roman Catholic Church, but technically the word Catholic simply means universal. Another question that needed to be considered was, is this book being used by all Christians? This question was obviously one of the later considerations, since it would take time for documents such as the epistles of Paul or Peter to circulate and gain wider usage. Nevertheless, it remains true that a text needed to be recognized beyond one region or sect, and books with widespread acceptance in diverse Christian communities inherently carried more weight than ones that were reduced to one single region. Even if one church was unsure of a book's apostolic origins, the fact that most churches deemed it apostolic suggested that they had good reason for doing so and therefore increased the likelihood of a text being authentic. This consideration helped guard against local or heretical texts claiming universal authority. Wide circulation and early acceptance increased confidence. And then, once these 4 criteria were evaluated, you arrived at the final criteria, which is, in and of itself, inspiration. If these 4 criteria were met, the church could safely say that something was inspired. Obviously, the question of apostolicity was of highest importance, but when that was in question, the following categories served as litmus tests to help arrive at an answer. As the first 2 centuries of the church passed, the church slowly but surely came to a consensus, arriving at the 27-book canon that we have today. That being said, let's take a look into the process itself. As the early church received and examined these books, things needed to be differentiated between the right and the wrong. And in general, the 2 broadest categories that we have are orthodox and heresy. Orthodox spoke of anything that was of sound doctrine, right teaching, while heresy spoke of any false doctrine deemed antithetical to Christian faith as established by the apostles. Technically, there is a third category, heterodox, beliefs deviating from accepted doctrine but not directly contradicting core teachings of the faith, but for the sake of simplicity, we'll primarily focus on these 2 categories. Within the heretical category, many books were quickly denounced as the fiction of heretics. These are the books that you usually hear about whenever people speak of the missing books of the Bible, who fiction writers like Dan Brown or historians like Bart Ehrman will try to convince you should be held as equal credible testimonies to the Christian faith. However, while there were splinter groups who accepted these books, such groups were quickly denounced as heretical by mainstream Christians. In reality, these books were never considered as canonical by anyone associated with the apostolic community. There were many other books which aren't outright heretical, but they weren't apostolic either. These books were usually orthodox or heterodox in their theology, consistent with apostolic teachings, or at the very least, not outright contradicting it. But even many of these books bore no evidence of being actually apostolic in origin, so they fall into the category of spurious. We have no evidence of them ever being taken seriously as canonical candidates. The books we're chiefly concerned with are the canonical books, the books which now exist as our 27-book New Testament. Within the canonical books, there are 2 categories, the acknowledged and the disputed. The acknowledged books were accepted as canonical almost immediately on a near universal level. While modern scholars, snobbishly thinking themselves intellectually superior to the early church, will question many of these books as well, we have no evidence of them being questioned by the earliest church communities. However, there were some books that were admittedly disputed, and these books took a little bit of time to iron out. Some of these were acknowledged early by some communities, but questioned by others, only to be later confirmed as canonical. Others were debated by many, for reasons which we will discuss more in depth. Others were employed as canonical in a few communities, only to be recognized as orthodox but not as canonical, and these are the things we're going to be talking about both in today's video and in the weeks to come. Thing to remember number 3, in addition to knowing how these books were recognized as canonical, the external resources give us an idea of roughly when the early church recognized these books as canon. Canon lists are the most useful in doing this, and we have access to some of these as early as the late 2nd century. However, even before our earliest canon lists, early Christian writers from throughout the 1st and 2nd centuries were already quoting New Testament books as authoritative scriptures, which tells us that they were functioning as authoritative long before people started compiling exclusive lists. Our earliest canon list, the Muratorian fragment, lacks 1st and 2nd Peter, James, and Hebrews, but we don't know if this is intentional or accidental. Since we have only discovered a fragment, it's very probable that some or all of these books were included, but that portion is missing. Many of the lists that we see lack revelation, which shows that the early church was wrestling through its inclusion for obvious reasons that we will discuss shortly. However, from very early on, nearly all of the 27 books of the New Testament were clearly affirmed or being considered, with some lists honestly admitting that there were some books still being discussed and debated about. As historians, lists such as these are actually the most useful because they once again highlight that the canon wasn't decided by a single group of people. Instead, it was an organic and gradual process. It makes sense that different churches in different regions and speaking different languages with limited access to different books would take time to reach a consensus, and this is exactly what we would expect. However, the New Testament canon as we have it seems to have been firmly fixed by the mid to late 4th century. This is the date usually highlighted by skeptical scholars who try to frame things as if the canon appeared out of nowhere as the result of some hidden agenda. The historical evidence runs contrary to this. Rather than the canon being developed according to a hidden agenda, all of our earliest historical evidence presents its development as a gradual process that took time, and this is exactly what we would expect if the early church was seeking to identify the canon, that is, figure out which books were actually inspired by God, rather than create the canon. If there was a natural canon, books inspired by God and therefore bearing his divine seal of approval, it only follows that these would function as canonical amongst their most immediate communities and eventually, over a process of time, be collected, vetted, and gathered together into an exclusive list, and this is exactly what the historical record reflects, contrary to what skeptical scholars would try to have you believe. Thing to remember, number 4. The greater majority of the New Testament was fixed extremely early. Our earliest evidence suggests to us that the majority of the books which we currently have in our New Testaments were recognized as canonical almost immediately. This includes the 4 Gospels, the book of Acts, the epistles of Paul, including Hebrews, 1 John, and 1 Peter. As far back as the 2nd century, we can testify that these books, 21 of our 27 New Testament books, have been accepted since the very beginning. And as will become evident shortly, this shouldn't decrease our confidence in the other books. There were good reasons for why people would question them, and the fact that they were questioned at all actually serves to strengthen our faith, not decrease it, because it suggests that the early church didn't blindly accept anything or outright reject it. Instead, they were in the pursuit of truth, and many of the books were recognized as truth very quickly, while other ones took a little bit of time. Thing to remember, number 5. No competing gospels were ever treated as equals in the mainstream church. Despite what Dan Brown or Bart Ehrman would have you believe, our earliest evidence attests to the fact that only 4 gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were ever viewed as authentic testimonies to the life of Christ. Others were written, but they were so late and so strange that they were never taken seriously by those belonging to the apostolic community. The same can be said for most other, quote, missing books of the Bible as well. We will talk more about them another time. Thing to remember, number 6. The disputed books were few and were eventually universally accepted. While most of the New Testament was recognized very quickly, we do have to admit that there was some debate about other books. However, as we will see, there's a good reason for such debate. The church didn't want to blindly accept them without taking time to vet them and ensure their authenticity. For instance, 12 canonical lists in the Greek and Latin traditions include all 7 general epistles, while other lists acknowledge them as being debated. Still another list includes 2 other early Christian epistles named 1st and 2nd Clement in the canon, but these were quickly recognized as being useful but not canonical. So for a moment, let's talk about the disputed books that did eventually make it into the canon. First up is the book of James. James was disputed because it wasn't cited as often by the early church fathers as other New Testament documents. But this makes sense for several reasons. On one hand, compared to the other New Testament documents, James is a very Jewish book, so it received greater usage in Jewish Christian circles than it did in the Greek-speaking West, which very quickly became the dominant majority of the church. Furthermore, while most traditions attribute the book to James the Just, the brother of Jesus, within the text itself, the author only identifies himself as James, a slave of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. Since James was an extremely popular name, and there were many prominent men named James in the early church, James son of Zebedee, James son of Alphaeus, and James brother of Jesus, to name a few, it makes sense why the early church would exercise some caution. While the church fathers admit that the book was disputed, it was still regarded as being known to most by Eusebius in his church history book. It is cited on occasion, and it was given canonical status by some. Our plethora of early manuscripts testifies to the fact that it was well known and used by early Christians. Furthermore, there's nothing in the book of James that is so radical or departing from normal Christian theology that would demand for its inclusion or exclusion to be such a big deal. Secondly is the book of Jude. Jude was disputed for many of the same reasons as James. The author of Jude identifies himself as Jude, a slave of Jesus Christ and the brother of James, which makes it easier to identify him as Jude, the brother of James and Jesus, and all our earliest evidence supports the fact that it stems from apostolic circles and contains apostolic teachings. Nevertheless, the book is only one chapter long, 25 verses, less than 500 words in the original Greek, and its short length helps explain why it was so rarely cited by church fathers. Because of how short it was a bit easier to overlook. Further, it shares a lot of material with the much longer 2 Peter, so it was more likely that somebody would quote from 2 Peter than they would from Jude. Nevertheless, Jude was acknowledged as canonical in our earliest canonical list, the Muratorian Fragment, as well as by many others in the centuries after. Thirdly is the book of 2 Peter itself. 2 Peter had a more difficult path to canonicity than any other book that we're talking about today. It's hard to know exactly why this is, but as best we can tell, it seems to be for the same reasons as James and Jude, reinforced by the fact that the language of the text is so different from 1 Peter. While this might make us nervous at first, I'd argue that it's actually beneficial to us that we see the church wrestling through the process of canonization, because once again, it tells us that they didn't just blindly accept books or gather everyone together to vote on them. Rather, they vetted them and took time affirming them, being rather open with their questions as they patiently sought out the truth. This further reinforces the fact that they had good reason for rejecting the so-called missing books of the Bible, because none of those books were even under dispute. As Michael J. Kruger points out, 2 Peter still has significantly more support for its inclusion in the canon than the best of those books that have been rejected. Next up are the books of 2nd and 3rd John. These books were disputed once again because of how little they were cited by the earliest church fathers, but this is exactly what we would expect given how short they are. They are each only one chapter long, the shortest books in the entire Bible. And even to this day, you'd be pressed to find people quoting 2nd and 3rd John on a regular basis, even in the modern church. Many early Christians still cited the books as canonical, even if they weren't referenced as often, and we have good reason to think that 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John might have been bound together very early on in their history, which suggests that they were identified as coming from a single author very early on, namely the Apostle John. On that note, it's unlikely to think that these books would have made their way into the canon had they been latecomers or had they circulated independently, because they're so short and they don't contribute much, and what they do contribute isn't groundbreaking theology that radically shatters what we as Christians already believe. There'd be no evident reason to force them into the canon or to try to exclude them, and so it makes sense why they don't show up and why they're kind of being questioned, because they're just so short. Last up is the book of Revelation. And the interesting thing about this is that Revelation seems to have had a very strange reception when it comes to the early church and how they received it. It was widely received at first, then it fell into dispute for a while, only to be widely received once again after further examination. However, it actually makes sense why this book would be disputed, because it is vastly different from any of the other books in the New Testament corpus. Nevertheless, B.W. Bacon remarks that there is no book in the entire New Testament whose external attestation can compare with that of Revelation in nearness, clearness, definiteness, and positiveness of statement. We have many extremely early manuscripts of Revelation which demonstrate that doubts regarding canonicity arose later in church history, and even then, only mainly in Eastern traditions. Eventually, this confusion dissipated, and Revelation was once again universally acknowledged as canonical. This then leads us back to our chart where we can begin to put all the different books in the respective categories. In the acknowledged section, the books that face no dispute are the majority of our New Testament documents: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, Hebrews, 1st John, 1st Peter. All those books were acknowledged very early on. There was no dispute about them. But then we go to the disputed category, and Revelation is the first one we can have here because it was acknowledged immediately at first, and then it fell into dispute, but then eventually it was acknowledged universally again, and so it's farthest to the left. Then, in the generally disputed category, we have James, Jude, 2 Peter, and 2nd and 3rd John, and eventually over time these also were acknowledged as being canonical as well, though it did take time for them to eventually get there. And then lastly, there were a few books that some small communities were treating as canonical for a while, but then eventually they began to realize that while these books are orthodox, they are not themselves canonical. And these would be books like 1st and 2nd Clement, Shepherd of Hermas, Epistle of Barnabas, and the Didache, and we're going to be talking about those books in future videos, so come back for those. Today I mainly wanted to focus on the canonical books. Beyond this, there were still other books though, right? There's the spurious books. These were the books that were never considered, but they were not outright heresy. These fall into the orthodox and heterodox camps. These would be books such as the Apocalypse of Peter, the Gospel to the Hebrews, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, and the Epistle of Polycarp. And then, lastly, there is the Fiction of Heretics. These were books that were never considered, but they were outright denounced by our earliest church sources. But these are also the books that most skeptic scholars would have you believe should have been in the Bible. Right? This is the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of the Ebionites, the Gospel of the Nazarenes, the Acts of John, the Acts of Andrew, the Apocryphon of John, and the Gospel of Mary. We're going to be discussing some of those in future videos as well, because to me, rather than being afraid of these books, I just want us to go and examine some of them just so you can see how strange and weird they are. Not only do they date well after the time of the apostles, but if you just read through them, it's very easy to see why they are not in the New Testament. And so whenever you hear all these scholars or whenever you look at the History Channel and they suggest that these missing books belong in the Bible, just go read the books. You'll very quickly realize why these books are not in the Bible. Whereas if you look at the disputed books down there that are still in the Orthodox camp, those books are actually pretty decent reads. They're just not apostolic in origin. All the other ones, like the Fiction of Heretics, they're just very, very, very strange books. So that being said, this all leads Michael Kruger to say the following. The development of the canon was not a simple affair, but a complex and often confusing process. Although there was a core New Testament canon by the end of the 2nd century, there was ongoing debate and disagreement over the remaining books for centuries. Even so, such canonical diversity must not be overplayed. We should expect that there would have been some level of disagreement throughout the recognition process. That is inevitable if God delivered his books in the real world of history. Such disagreements do not require that we declare all books inherently equal, nor do they prevent us from knowing which books are from God. Indeed, when the individual merits of each book are examined, it quickly becomes clear that the early church had reasons, and quite good ones, for rejecting some and accepting others. Neil Lightfoot agrees with this, saying, in conclusion, it is important to emphasize that no church council made the canon of Scripture. No church, by its decrees, gave to or pronounced on the books of the Bible their infallibility. The Bible owes its authority to no individual or group. The church does not control the canon, but the canon controls the church. Although divine authority was attributed to the New Testament books by the later church, this authority was not derived from the church, but was inherent in the books themselves. As a child identifies its mother, the later church identified the books which it regarded as having unique authority. And therefore, we can say this, these are the things we can conclude about the development of the New Testament canon. Regarding the natural canon, the books which were actually inspired by God, the New Testament canon started to exist the moment it was written. As soon as Paul or Matthew or Peter or Luke put their pen to the page, the canon of Scripture began to exist, right? That is when it began to exist, but it did take time for us to recognize this canon, which leads us to our discussion of the functional canon. Man's discovery and acceptance of that canon unfolded over time. Firstly, the legitimacy of a canonical text hinged on apostolic authority. As Christ's appointed authoritative ambassadors, the apostles defined the rule, the canon, the measure of what Christianity is or isn't, and in most instances, texts were accepted immediately based on being written by an apostle or a close associate of an apostle. Obviously, the people who originally received these books would have known who wrote them, and that would have changed how they responded to them. Whenever the church in Ephesus received Paul's letter, they would have known this came from Paul, and therefore they would have known that it was apostolic in origin. However, it would take time for other people to vet that and make sure that was true. Secondly, we also know that the early church was not haphazard in their approach to Scripture. The church did not blindly accept any book bearing the name of an apostle, right? If so, all those missing books would be in our Bibles. Rather, the historical witness shows that they took great care in assessing which books were genuinely apostolic in origin, right? There were some books which claimed to be by apostles, but they wanted to take their time to make sure they were actually apostolic. Since 2 Peter is so different than 1 Peter, they wanted to make sure that it was actually by Peter, and that took some time. Thirdly, while we don't have all the details, the information we do have gives us confidence in trusting that we have the correct books, no more, no less, in the 27 books of the New Testament canon. In some cases, we clearly know why they were accepted. In others, we don't know exactly why they were accepted, but we trust that the original compilers had their reasons. This then leads us to our discussion of the exclusive canon, and we can say this. The New Testament was firmly fixed by the mid-4th century AD. However, even on that note, most of the books were firmly fixed by the mid-2nd century AD, and others were regionally accepted and gradually adopted, leading us to the mid-4th century AD, when we can say that the canon was firmly fixed. However, that date right there is the one that many skeptical scholars will hyper-focus on, and that's because they are presupposing that God did not inspire these. However, if you adopt a theistic worldview, and you are trying to figure out which books were actually inspired by God, we would say the canon began to exist far earlier. It began to exist in the 1st century, and it was fixed in the 1st century. However, it took us a little while to fully recognize those books, which is exactly what you would expect if there wasn't some fixed agenda where people were voting on books. And so I would say that the historical evidence gives us very good reason to believe that yes, we do in fact have the correct books in our New Testaments. That being said, I don't think that we should be afraid of the so-called missing books of the Bible, and so what we're going to do over the course of the next several videos is we're going to take a look at those missing books, and we're going to figure out for ourselves why they weren't included. Spoiler alert, they're kind of strange. And so that being said, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope that it is strengthening your confidence in the books that we have in the Bible if you lacked any confidence to begin with, and I am excited to go into future stuff in the future, because that's how future stuff works. My name is David Tate. This is Now Let's Be Honest. Be sure to keep a smile on your face. Don't let anybody steal your joy. Remember who you are. And of course, Maranatha. Bye.